Hi everyone, and welcome to the grand final of Joynt Goals. That sounds way too different. Joynt Scroll 2021. My name is Emily, and I'm being joined on the panel by Amy, Daniel, and then we've got Andre and Dre. So first of all, let's just have another round of applause for bit one and Auckland one. That has been selected is this House believes that Joe Biden should step down before. Without further ado, I will now call upon the first speaker of the Affirmative team. And just a reminder to audience members to just keep it quiet during the session so we can hear.
In this debate, we're working towards basically a democratic agenda. That is to say, we want to win the 2024 presidential election, but we also care about things such as upcoming midterms, local elections, the future of the party, and the future of America in general. And in order to ensure the electability of the Democrats into the future, we think that Joe Biden ought to step down and allow Kamala Harris to take his place as president of America. He would ideally step down, for example, between the 22 midterms and the 2024 election cycle to give us some time basically to be president and then to go on and win the election. What I'm going to explain in the speech is a couple of things. First, it's going to be the various reasons why Kamala Harris is very electable, but particularly when she's had the opportunity to be president first will be very electable. That means the Democrats will win the next election, which is good, but also why in terms of the long-term health of the Democratic Party and of America in general, we ought to have Kamala Harris as president, Joe Biden ought to step down. Okay, let's talk about electability. First thing that I want to say here is that Joe Biden can't run again. The basic reason is he's quite old, he wants to go home, hang out with his dog and his family. And the reason why that's important is because it's a very high risk thing to have someone get sick while they are in the process of getting towards an election or while they are themselves the president. That's because you run the risk that at the last moment you have to swap someone in and you lose all of the momentum that you've been building up across that period. But it's also because there are very few things in America which are less popular than someone who is perceived not to be able to carry out their duty. For example, the time when Donald Trump had his lowest ever approval rankings was literally just when he got COVID. Similarly, when Hillary Clinton got pneumonia on the campaign trail in 2016, that was when she was at her lowest. That's just apparently, if you don't think someone can do the job, you're unwilling to elect them. So, we want the optimally electable person to be in charge of the Democratic Party going forward. And we think that if we give Kamala Harris the opportunity to be the president, she is going to be extremely electable for a number of reasons. The first of those is that she gets a significant incumbency bonus. How does that work? When you get to be the president, you get a few things. Firstly, you just get name recognition on the basis that you are the president. Secondly, you're in the news all the time. Again, you're just like doing policies, you're doing press conferences, you're flying around in Air Force One looking cool all the time, so you get to be on the news. And the third, so you get to basically control, like the talking points, control the agenda of the election. But the last thing is that you actually get to do policies, right? Kamala Harris gets the opportunity to pass things that Americans like, to provide experience and demonstrate on her CV that she is a strong and capable, caretaker of America. And actually, if you look at the things that Joe Biden's basically done so far, a lot of what he's done is just set up a really good team. So we think like Kamala Harris can just kind of keep that ball rolling. For example, there's a lot of work that's being done in the Department of Education in the States at the moment about debt reform and those sorts of things at universities, which is probably going to be coming up 2023, 2024 is the time when they're going to be passable. We would let Kamala Harris do that. Those are some easy wins that we think Joe Biden can tee up for her to kick over the post. So at the end of all of this, we think that Kamala Harris is firstly going to very, very easily win the Democratic nomination without basically any fight. In the history of the United States of America, no sitting president has ever subsequently lost the nomination for their party because of the reasons that I've described that make them very strong. But on top of that, the party itself looks very strong and united in a number of ways. People like to vote for parties that look strong and united and aren't fighting with each other and aren't fighting over who the leadership should be, because they look like a group that can work together, right? But secondly, also because you don't talk bad about each other, you don't create bad press about the other people within your party, and you have united messaging all the way through. I'm hearing a lot of yeses, so I think we're going to get a big gotcha, neat intro, but we'll wait for that one. The last thing I want to say here is this is especially important because Republicans are divided between they continue on with the Trumpian thing or go to some Larry Hogan types who are a bit more sensible, Mitt Romney-ish type style Republicans who hark back to the ye old days in 2012, right? So we think that because there is relatively divided messaging among the Republicans, if you can have that united messaging, if you can have those incumbency bonuses to Kamala Harris, that allows you to win the election fairly easily. Yes, Sean, go ahead.
As far as I know, it's very rare for a president to step down in the middle of his term. What would people think and how would the media spin this, given all the speculation about the team and about Biden himself?
Just I imagine he just come out and say all of the things we think Kamala Harris is a really good candidate, I'm getting old, I want to hang out with my dog, etc. Okay, things I supported at the start. So, second thing I want to talk about then, having moved on from incumbency, is why Kamala Harris in and of herself is just a popular character. And there's a couple of things to talk about here. Firstly, Kamala Harris is just fairly moderate in a similar way to how Joe Biden is. That just plays well with American voters. She appeals to a relatively wide base across America. But on top of that, she also provides a bit of a grand historical narrative, right? People like to get on board and they get enthusiastic with an election which is a first. And having the first woman of colour be president and having her be the first one to be elected gives her that grand historical narrative and gives her a lot of grandeur that people are likely to get around. But on top of that, she's been associated with a president that people mostly like in the form of Joe Biden, but also she just comes from California. It's a very big state. She's got a lot of momentum from there. Lots of people support her. But also, she has very low baggage, right? The critiques generally that have come across Kamala Harris tend to be critiques that have come from the far left about what she did when she was Attorney General in California. But there's actually very little about Kamala Harris that is dislikable on the right. Most of the things that she did, and most of the critiques that came from the far left during the primaries in 2020 or 2019 or whatever year, most of those critiques actually just make her look fine and sensible to moderates, for example, being tough on crime, etc. So there really isn't a lot there, as opposed to Biden has, going to Strom Thurmond's funeral, etc. Those sorts of things that make him look kind of bad. No, thank you, Sharuka. Last thing I want to talk about is that you avoid Republican talking points. And basically what I want to say here is that on the basis of the fact that the Democrat Party has a very wide scope of people that come under the umbrella of that party, it is just incumbent always on Democratic leaders within the party to talk about things like race and gender. And what you end up with when you have white candidates having to talk about race and gender is very clumsy moments. So for example, Joe Biden just promising to put a black woman on the Supreme Court. For example, Hillary Clinton carrying hot sauce around in her bag. Those are the sorts of things that are very bad for a couple of reasons. The first is that for minority voters within the Democrat Party who actually just want to hear about environmental or economic policy or whatever, every time the white Democratic leader goes down to the southern border, all they talk about is immigration and the wall and those sorts of things. So we think giving some, so we think it's better for Kamala Harris in that way. And the main reason why is just like if you think back to the Obama presidency, just by the fact that Obama was himself from a minority group just meant that he didn't have to make silly promises like I'm going to put a black person on the Supreme Court, because he just embodies the fact that they were making strides towards that. But that's really important in another way, which is just sort of becomes fodder for the culture war when people make really silly calls like that and look clumsy on TV. It makes it look to like white voters and Republican voters like all they care about are like gimmicky woke policies that get carried by Fox News, carried on, turned into fodder. That makes you unelectable if you can be made to look like that's all you care about. If you spend your time talking about policy, talking about economics, etc., it's more likely that you're going to appeal, therefore, to the white moderates, the white Republicans. Last thing I want to say here is just to comment on the long-term future of the Democrat Party. And the thing about Joe Biden is he's very, very establishment, but his establishment particularly in the fact that he's attached to the old ways of doing government. And that was part of the reason why he was elected, and that's part of his appeal, but actually we think it's bad in the long term. Joe Biden is unlikely to be the president that admits DC and Puerto Rico as states in the United States. He's unlikely to be the president that gets rid of the filibuster. But those are things that for the good of America we ought to do, just for the sake of democracy, allowing people to be represented within that democracy. But also they're things that are good for the Democrats because those would become Democrat Senates, would disempower the Republican advantage in the Senate, so it's good for the Democrat Party.
I really like Kamala Harris too, but if we just take a sense check and consider what happens when you put the woman of color, or just a woman in general, in charge at times of immense speculation, what does the media do? Do they focus on her policy platform, or do they try to figure out what's going wrong with the party, what is causing so much disunity that they had to change the candidate in the middle of the presidential term? Judith Collins may not have been prime minister, but I think is a prime example of the tanking you get to electability as soon as you create the basis for speculation to occur about what went wrong in the Democratic Party. That's why I think I want to be very clear in terms of what our countermodel in this debate is, which is that Kamala will run in 2024, but Biden is not stepping down mid-presidency. Biden is not giving Fox News the scope to create disunity in the Democratic Party. That's why the last half of Sam's speech is useless for their analysis, but does a lot of the legwork to prove why it is that Kamala is very electable and we get better results for the Democratic Party. We're going to look at three things in this speech. Firstly, why their model reopens the left-liberal divide and allows for Republicans to take advantage of that. Secondly, step through exactly how the media responds to a president stepping down in the middle of his term. And finally, tell you why this delegitimizes the Democratic Party. Few pieces of extraneous rebuttal. In terms of Kamala's name recognition, right? She's the Harris in Biden-Harris. She gets that name recognition when she does interviews and can talk about race under status quo. We allow her to claim credit for the kinds of policies that she is pushing for on our side of the house without overshadowing it with speculations of whether she was the manipulative woman that made Biden step down before he needed to. They make her nomination harder by creating divide within the Democratic Party. They overshadow her successes by a media storm that focuses on why Biden stepped down in the middle of his term rather than on the policies they were able to push through. Finally, just in terms of long-term health, most of the analysis that comes out about Kamala being likable is analysis that we can carry to our side of the house. What they have to prove in this debate is why she can't win if Biden just decides not to run in 2024. They get very little comparative analysis here. We're going to tell you exactly why it is that stepping down midterm uniquely creates
the seeds of division in the Democratic Party that is so bad for anyone's electability. Why does this reopen left-liberal divide? Democrats lost to Trump in 2016 because they didn't have any internal coherency. Biden resolved that divide by creating a coalition that accepted his presidency. Sure, people might have wanted Bernie more, but the acceptance from the majority that was so scarred by the disunity that led to everything that happened after 2016 is the reason why such a broad coalition came out to support Biden's presidency. Note though that there is still a small and vocal, passionate minority that hates Biden and will capitalize on him stepping down for their own interests to make the Democratic Party more socialist than they can be realistically in the political framework of America. Why is this the case? Firstly, it shows that either Biden or his team has no faith in the broad coalition that he has led to win the election again. It suggests that he doesn't want to capitalize on the large amount of voters that voted him into power. Secondly, it's a political opening, right? As soon as you have someone who is the acting president and not the president themselves, that gives socialists the ability to say, maybe AOC or someone from the squad should run against this person in the future election, because they're not the real president. They don't have that legitimacy behind them in the same way they would on our side of the house. The third thing to say, though, is that from the outside, it looks like the Democrats are infighting again because the airtime revolves around resolving this clash, figuring out why it was that this president with such a broad coalition decided that he had to step down. Is there some reason that he felt that his party would not be able to win again? Did he not trust in this Kamala's ability to win an election in 2024? We think this means that people focus more on resolving that clash instead of rallying for Democrats. The fourth thing to say, though, is that the capital that is involved in rallying for individual candidates and then trying to resolve that around Kamala in 2024 is far more than just rallying for the Democrats writ large. We don't even give you the opportunity to try and stand another candidate against Kamala when she runs in 2024 because her media narrative is never overshadowed by the decisions that Biden made when he stepped down. Fifthly, we tell you that incumbency bias and that strong force means that the status quo discussion is about what the Democrats are doing in 2024, not which individual candidates are running in 2024. That's really good. Let's unpack this material. Firstly, disunity in the Democratic Party makes 2020 far harder than it needs to be. Finally, note that empowering this faction doesn't actually get you the kinds of policy change they want on their side of the house because it's who that policy is associated with. So Biden can pass the most expansive American Indian policy through budget reconciliation. AOC probably can't, even if it's the same policy. So we think in terms of how that narrative is pushed, it needs to be through a candidate like Biden until 2024. How does the media respond to midterm step down? And note that this exclusively proves why they can't claim any of their benefits in this debate. Firstly, presidents don't normally step down midterm unless there is a huge scandal, right? There's no reason for someone to step down mid-presidency. So even if they're like, oh, Biden will just say he feels old and wants to play with his dogs, the media starts to speculate, right? They already think he's Swiss cheese brain. They'll be like, the man's got fucking dementia, let's kick him out. The Democrats don't know who to coalesce behind. Importantly, note that this overtakes the news cycle, right? In the same way that the National Party leadership changes meant that no one knew what the fuck the National Party stood for, you don't get discussion about the expansive policy changes that Biden pushes through. You only get discussion about who the new leader is going to be. We think that's really harmful. The third thing to say, though, is that you give fodder to the people who speculate about things like Biden's mental health. That's really bad. It doesn't matter when it happens, right? But because even if he steps down right after the mid-elections, it still comes back at election time. You crowd out candidates and their ability to talk about policy because Fox News and CNN are busy asking Kamala, well, why actually did Biden step down? We don't really care what your policies on race are. We want to know why this historic event happened. The second thing to say, though, is that it disconnects successors, i.e. Kamala, from Biden's platform because people disconnect her from Biden's COVID relief plan because they've forgotten that that plan even happened. They're busy talking about why he stepped down. Note that in the swing states like Florida, that were most assisted by these relief plans, that's exactly where we want discussion about policy happening, not speculation in the media. Finally, why this delegitimizes the Democratic Party. People voted Biden in, right? And not importantly, that this is people like respectability voters who feel betrayed by the fact that they went against their party allegiance to vote in a president that has now stepped down and betrayed them. We think you lose those kind of Republican legitimacy voters, but you also get a sense of betrayal from people on the left. Note that the harm of this in this debate is that the incentive to turn out and vote in elections decreases at the point where you feel like your voice is no longer being heard. And turnout matters in this debate because 10,000 votes spread across swing districts can decide who wins and loses the 2024 election. But the second thing to say here is that we are also the side that upholds faith in democracy, which is currently at an all-time low in America as backslide continues to happen. You're more likely to accept backslide on their side of the house, things like court stacking after 2022, if you think that your vote doesn't matter. We think that's incredibly dangerous. I think the final thing to say, though, is that lots of this is based on norms and on legality anyway. At the point where a norm exists that presidents see out their term, shifting that changes the calculus from any possible policy discussion. It's unclear how they get elections that are winnable on their side.
Now listen, Jack, here's the deal. The main issue I actually have with what we've heard from Umbar is essentially, well, it's two-pronged. We'll bring this out fully in the speech. But we just don't believe that voters actually care about the kinds of norms of serving out a full term in office that Umbar claimed exist. But more generally, we think even if this norm is something that voters care a lot about, the general norm is that you fill out your term in office and run for re-election. And so their characterization of voter behavior is one that is hugely marginal, right? That the world is going to come crashing down on the Democratic Party if Joe Biden says, I am ill, I can't hold up the responsibilities of office, this great vice president is taking over. But there are no equal harms if he goes, I am ill, the presidency is tough for me, that's why I won't do it for another 4 years, but I'm going to stay around as a sort of not particularly competent person for 2 more, and there'll be an open primary after the fact, right? Their characterizations didn't really make a whole bunch of sense on their own sort of view of what norms we actually care about in politics, but also just more broadly, we don't think it engaged with the action material that we were able to unify the party through the unique benefits of incumbency. So that's the main sort of through line that's running through the rest of my speech. How am I going to divide it up? We'll start with this thing about just general media response, then we'll talk about disunity on the left liberal base within the Democratic Party, and lastly we'll tie all that together with some sort of more extraneous additional material about who wins in 2024. Firstly, about the media response, right? The main real thrust, and probably the main initial mechanism we got from the negating team, was to say that there will be a huge deal of speculation at the point at which Joe Biden announces he is stepping down. It's going to create a cloud over Kamala Harris coming into office, and it's going to cause a whole bunch of questions about the competency of Biden and whether the Democrats are really not a party particularly fit for government. The thing is, right, this was basically just predicated on the assertion of a norm that presidents should always serve out a whole term in office, and the assertion that it's going to be particularly bad because presidents don't normally step down mid-term. Sure, presidents historically haven't, but presidents also historically haven't been fucking 80 years old, right? We think we're probably a little bit outside the normal norms of office. The last 4 years might also attest to that, and voters are also a bit more willing to see norms bent ever so slightly to the margins if it gives them a better quality of their body politic. Right? What do you think actually happens at the point at which Joe Biden says this? He probably says, I am 80 years old. This is a particularly difficult job. It's one I don't feel I'm any more qualified to hold. That's why I'm passing it over to my incredibly qualified vice president who has been doing good things and has 2 years experience in office. We also think that just more generally, we got these ideas of broad speculation about what this meant about Biden's mental state, right? We think if there is speculation about what Biden's mental state was like at the time before he resigned, it doesn't matter because he's not president anymore, right? The crucial mechanism we gave you is that an octogenarian with memory issues isn't a news story unless they have the nuclear codes. And that literally goes away at the point to which he steps down from office, right? We think that the more likely response to Biden announcing he's stepping down for health reasons is probably akin to Todd Mueller announcing he was resigning for mental health reasons, an outpouring of sympathy for a person in public service who is broadly quite popular, who just has the courage to say they can no longer hack it in this job and are taking a step to just protect themselves, right? We just don't think it's particularly true. We think at the margins, maybe InfoWars says that Biden was dead for years or something weird, but it probably won't actually affect the behavior or opinions of most ordinary voters. That is an incredibly weird mechanism. Also, just like we do have some, like I don't want to make it too example heavy, right? But we do have governors, which are like mini presidents of states that resign all the time midterm for any fucking reason, and it doesn't generally affect the partisan lean, right? Sarah Palin in Alaska literally said she was bored of being governor and wanted to go beyond reality TV, and didn't affect the quality of the Republican Party because we just pushed back against the existence of a norm serving out a term in office. It was made up, it doesn't exist, and even if it does, the norms are willing to be bent at the point to which you have an 80-year-old president who is in of itself defining a norm. Also, more strategically, no response to our material about how the bigger harm from media coverage is letting Biden stay in office and watching him slowly decline as the toll of the most difficult job on earth takes its effect on an 80-year-old person who already has, through no fault of his own, difficulties communicating. We think there was a real risk and no response to Penno's material about the next time he falls down the stairs and he gets more injured, the next time he has to go in unplanned surgery, the worse it is for the party. Because the worst thing for a politician's popularity, particularly a commander-in-chief, is if they appear weak. Just no response to that. We think the media environment is far worse in their world, where Joe Biden is clearly not up to the job, continues to hold that job. Conversely, we get sort of the broad redemptive glow of the arc of a person stepping down while they still have the capacity to do so, rather than leaving the White House either through the ballot box or literally feet first, right? We'll take that for your life.
So, would it be worse if, in the status quo, you can obviously spin media around by being fine even if he's not fine. But don't you confirm the fact that he might have not been fine while he was president if he suddenly steps down?
We think you can spin it for now, but the point you made is it's probably going to get more and more difficult to spin the closer you get to the upcoming election. And it's probably much worse. Even in their world where Joe Biden says, I'm not running again, this is a world where now Kamala Harris is running for the nomination as the incumbent vice president. And there are huge questions about, is your president fit for office? Why isn't he running for another term? Why does he still have the nuclear codes, right? The narrative is much worse on their world, even if you buy their characterization of what voters genuinely care about. Okay, next point. Disunity on a left liberal schism within the Democratic Party. Because this was the other quite important mechanism, and we think it ties quite well into what we were saying. A really crucial way that the Democrats can win in 2024 is if they look like a unified party that can all sort of row together like the National Party voting that John Keir from a few years ago. So at the point to which that's sort of the main characterization, they're able to win the election by appealing to a unified party base, especially when the Republicans are disunified. That takes a lot of weight. Do you know what really causes a lot of disunity to a political party? An open race for the presidency where anyone can step in, like the last open race for the presidency where 25 people ran with 25 different arguments about why all the other 24 people would be the worst president ever and they would be great, right? We think it's just objectively so true that there is no way to, better way to guarantee unity within a political party than having a primary in which there is an incumbent president who steamrolls all opposition. Why is that? Because everyone, even the ones who do have ideological gripes with the current president, know they can't win, so they wait for the next election they've got a better shot, right? There was left-wing disdain from the Bernie Sanders wing with the Democratic Party throughout the Obama years, but they waited until Obama wasn't running in a primary to actually expose that schism to the wider media because they knew they couldn't win until there was an open seat. So this is a world where an incredibly vulnerable Vice President Kamala Harris, who doesn't have the benefits that we approach to be a unique benefit of the awesome power of the presidency, and is able to actually win that primary far more easily. So we give you that quite clear mechanism as to why that is the case. The sort of dissent is minimized until later in the game when the people who have that dissent think they've got a chance of actually winning a primary, which is their world where the primary is open, there's no incumbent president, and also, like, people who are moderate or on the fence about Kamala Harris can now be won over to her by her ability to pass transformative moves that only the president can do. Like Penno said, like eliminating student debt with the stroke of a pen by executive order, by literally just having the ability to control the media narrative from the bully pulpit that only a president gets. We think it was just a really, really weird characterization that just didn't make a lot of sense to say that you're only going to get disunity at the point at which there's an incumbent president who is going to clearly win that primary and win it by like 90 to 95% in the same way every incumbent president has in any primary going back all the way to the beginning of the party system. So that's the clearest way to get this kind of unity. And also, you're just literally right, she's a new president. She gets that honeymoon period. She comes in, she's historic. People get sort of motivated to want to cement that historical narrative. We think there's with a more fractured party, there's with a more fractured media environment. We get sympathy for Biden, who is now gone. We welcome in the new, proud to propose.
Let me be very clear what the difference between the teams are. On our side, we support Kamala Harris running for presidency in 2024. On their side, we support Biden stepping down very soon, but for some reason after the midterms, so as not to affect any midterm voting. I thought that was fine to do that anyway. But also what that means is that they explain why the unique benefit of that incumbency period of someone who was never elected being in the president's seat and how that's going to be seen by the public actually helps Kamala Harris win in 2024. Note the Republicans aren't as disunified as they want to say. Trump has already had lots of talks and made basically a campaign speech. He's running again. We need to be sure we're winning, and this debate's about the margins of who's more likely to get Kamala Harris to win and a unified Democratic Party that's likely to vote for her. I'm going to first talk about what's similar on both sides. Secondly, about what F thinks is symmetrical and explain why it's not. And then finally, look at the differences, right? So one about the messaging that happens to society in the US, but then also about the party itself and the likelihood of election. Firstly, what is actually similar on both sides? Basically, in the entirety of Sam's second half of his speech, right, was about the individual electability of Kamala Harris, which means that that still applies on our side because she's also running in 2024. But it also means that she's likely to win even without the benefits of incumbency that Sam wanted to talk about, because those two things were completely unlinked in his speech. That means that we also have all those benefits, but not the costs that I will talk about later on. So thank you. What does F think is not symmetrical? They wanted to say that incumbency was the point here. The first point they wanted to say was name recognition, the fact that she's in the news. You can get that as vice president, right? For example, the name recognition that Biden got as Obama's vice president. But also you have a good team, because you can carry the good team you had with Biden right on to the next election and have all those connections that you've already made with the name recognition that you've done work in that office. But also you can get that reform under the name, right? Like Biden, for example, could claim benefits and hold over from the Obama legacy. Kamala Harris can do the exact same thing and explain her role in those outcomes. So thank you. But also, she would be the first black woman to be president on our side of the house. On their side of the house, she's already become the first black woman before that election. The key difference here, though, is that it's not that, oh, she's president now, but she's president in a way that no one ever expected her to become president, right? People voted for Biden with Kamala as vice president. They were not expecting her to be president now. That is the significant change. That's why voters will be upset. That's why Republicans will weaponize it. And that's why all the harms that we told you actually manifests itself in a unique sense. Before I move on to the normal messaging, which will solidify what I just said, yes.
But you guys haven't double checked material about how Kamala Harris will win the nomination for incumbency. So you haven't proven that she's going to win the nomination. So you can't claim half my speech.
All right, let's talk about nomination, right? Because the nomination itself, all the benefits of Kamala Harris as being very good at being able to explain race issues, but also being moderate and therefore liked by a lot of people, is unique. It is not unique in the sense that that means she would also do well in the nomination. It's not tied to an incumbency. The second point there, though, is that they assume that the incumbency benefit comes from just being president. That's not true, right? It comes from being voted in as president. That you've gone through the electoral cycle, that you've done the whole campaigning, and that people have voted for you specifically. That is not going to be the case now, right? Because that Kamala Harris never went through that. So this is going to be like Biden going through that himself as he had to after he was vice president for Obama. It's not like just because Biden happened to be president because Obama stopped being president, that he would have any of those benefits at all. In fact, it's going to be the opposite, as Umbar explained to you, because of the media spin on it from the Republicans, because of the media spin on it in general, but also about the disunification in that. So, no, the example here would be that she doesn't get any benefit of just being president if that wasn't presidency, that wasn't an earned presidency by being voted in. So therefore, it's likely on their side, she still faces the same amount of pressure by having a lot of other people competing against her as on our side, but we say it's actually worse on their side for all the analysis that Umbar gave to you, in that the people who voted for Biden as a compromise now feel betrayed, right? Because Biden was no longer there in half of his presidency. It was Kamala Harris instead, something some people that they don't like as well, but also it broke that kind of pact between the left and the liberals in the Democratic Party, which means you get that resurgence of disunity where people start running because they think they were betrayed by that compromise they made, and therefore you get far less likely on their side for Kamala to win the nomination. Let's talk about this norm, right? This norm actually doesn't make any sense because, sure, first of all, let's talk about what happens when he's the president and stepping down, right? So if he steps down at the end of his presidency, he can say, I'm stepping down because I don't want to do it anymore. And that should be more normal than if he stops immediately, suddenly in the middle of his presidency. Because that seems urgent, right? As opposed to being like, yeah, I'm going to hand it over. Kamala, you go and do the campaigning, and I'll hand over power if you win the election. That's not as urgent, right? So the speculation then of why he's doing that isn't based on that urgency. When he immediately stops and has to literally give over power to the vice president, people are going to ask why. And it's not that, oh, now he's suddenly got mental health, then he stopped, he no longer has the nuclear codes. It's that you lied to us in the previous election. He was always having mental health problems, and you lied to us and let him do this, and he was, what if we didn't catch him so soon? He could have literally nuked the world. That's the media spin. That's what they let that speculation get to on the other side of the house. So that's why, as well, the difference in the 2024 stepping down is the key thing that wins us this debate. This is not about a governor retiring. Nobody gives a shit about governors. This is the president. For all the reasons of the history of how Biden's narrative worked in the election prior, this is far more inflammatory because of the mental health claims that were made in the past. Let's talk about Biden declining in age, right? We don't think Biden is going to decline in age so far in the 2 years into 2024, but if that's something that I'm worried about, we can always spin narratives around that to make sure that doesn't come out. It's also not likely, there's a risk of doing that. But the moment that you suddenly step down, as I've already explained, you don't need it to be true, right? That media spin happens already. Conservatives talk about that, it's also more likely to be believed. Nobody cares about the truth anymore in politics, and people are more likely to believe that on the other side of the house. Finally, let's talk about a unified party. No, thank you. We have already explained to you that there are significant harms from breaking that compromise that happened between the liberal and the leftist elements of the Democratic Party. And the harm to this is not just that you will be attacked from the Democratic Party within during the nominations, as they were worried about, it's probably flipping that argument on them, but it also means that the difference actually works within the Democratic Party for the long term, right? Because the careful compromise that was made to beat Trump is now less likely to be made the second time because of the perception that Biden, being the president, was a lie. That he was always going to give power off to Kamala, or that he was always mentally ill, and you lied to us about that, means that the relatively radical left within the party are more likely to spin against the other people nominated, but also reduce and repress turnout in the nominations itself, which means Kamala is less likely to win under their side, but also which means whatever happens in the nomination process carries on to the actual election process, which means even if Kamala gets nominated under their side, by all the analysis that Umbar showed you already, applies to the election itself, which means you might even have a Trump presidency under their side. If this debate was about actually winning the presidency in 2024, they've done a very, very bad job of explaining why Biden has to step down now, as opposed to why you're far, far more secure in getting Kamala Harris in power in 2024 on our side of the house, side by side later.
Let's think very carefully about what that team has to prove in order to win this debate. They have to prove that when Biden steps down, the media will spend the next 1 or 2 years only talking about the fact that Biden steps down and not about any of the things that President Harris is doing. They then have to prove that in a world in which Biden steps down later and Kamala is just a vice president tied to a president who was obviously sick and ailing throughout his presidency, but chose to put the American people at risk, why she will win a contested nomination without incumbency benefits and then beat the Republican Party now that both look equally disunited. That's what they have to prove. We told you presidents have incumbency benefits. It's historically true, and we gave you mechanisms for it. We told you she would be guaranteed to win the nomination uniting the party. We told you she would win, and she was the president we needed. What am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about this narrative stuff and put the final pin in it. I'm going to talk about why she is just simply more electable. First, talking about nomination victory, and then talking about incumbency benefits and the things they haven't adequately dealt with. But let's first talk about that narrative. And the first thing to note here is just to do a realism check about the media, right? Media exists on news stories that get people interested. Obviously, when Biden steps down, it will be a massive story. Everyone will cover it. They will very quickly burn through all the material available on that, and then they will need something new to entice people and get them to watch the news each morning. What will that be? That will be the counter-narrative. Kamala's first 100 days after taking over from Biden. Kamala's new policies. How Kamala is developing on what Biden has set up. What Kamala is going to be doing. How Kamala's campaign will be run. The talk shows she will go on. The op-eds that will be written about her. All the counter-narrative they never addressed. And so the Biden resigning will burn out. But note, how else will it be addressed, even if it continues? They've assumed that you can put it in a bad light. But first note, Biden doesn't have to say, all right, I'm out today, see you later, bye guys. He can say, I'm stepping down progressively. But he can also say, and imagine the narrative in which he says, I have decided that the time has come for me to step down. I do not want to put the American people at risk by continuing to operate when I know I may decline. Kamala has been working with me as my partner in chief in running this country. She is ready to step up. And note on narrative, that's actually already been somewhat of the spin of mainstream media. Kamala often appears beside Joe Biden. She's often given credence for a lot of policy decisions he's making right now. The very reason we have vice presidents is because the norm is that the president might fucking die and the vice president has to step up. So people actually expect that person to be good and be in a partnership and be able to take over. So there is no giant, dangerous media narrative. But note, even if Fox News spins with this, actually Kamala stepping up complies with their own criticisms of Joe. They said that Joe is old and ailing and may leave, right? So if Joe does, he actually satisfies what they said. Kamala isn't tied with his burden because she's young, she's considered sprightly, she's considered fresh-faced and able to deal with things, so she doesn't get that criticism that Joe has been burdened with, right? So the media moves on. We have an alternative narrative we can present to them that's persuasive. Joe Biden has his own narrative. But consider, even if the media doesn't move on, consider the alternative, like harmful narratives that can exist
even if it is considered bad that Joe Biden has stepped down? Well, first you have the fact that there's going to be a primary because there's going to be other people contesting the race. I'll talk more about this later. But when there's other people contesting the race, you now have the narrative of disunity in the Democrats. There's different people attack each other on who should lead the Democratic Party and run. To create a narrative of disunity at a time when you want to compete the Republican Party, which in their world could be united around Trump, or could more predictably be through determining whether it should be Trumpism or non-Trumpism, right? But you also have the narrative that Biden was sick. He knew he was, but he didn't do anything about it, and Kamala went along with that. She exposed the American people to risk when she should have been the one to step up. That's an incredibly harmful narrative the media will spin about her. You can bet by God Fox News would spin that. That's the narrative they didn't deal with. Okay, why is it easier for her to win then? Alright, and just note on that, so they said, if Biden sits down, it acknowledges that he's previously been sick and that looks bad. First, it's not tied to Kamala because she's actually stepping up and being the responsible person and taking up the role, right? But B, Biden could just frame it as, I'm not dying right now, but I'm making a responsible decision. It's easily possible to spin that. Okay, let's then talk about why it's easier for her to win. And first thing here, they haven't proved why she would win the nomination. Why haven't they proved that? Because they just asserted that she will because they said she's popular for all the reasons we said. But no, our reasons were contingent on the fact that she's tied with those incumbency benefits. She has the airtime of being the president. She's seen as making presidential decisions. She's seen as someone who's implementing life-changing policy for millions of Americans, right? In the alternative world, the people who are critical of her, who would otherwise be afraid to run against her because they know the power of the incumbency and the power of policy decisions to appeal to voters, would run against her. You would get people coming out of the woodwork, Elizabeth Warren, people who want to challenge her on far left issues, and people that perceive they are more conservative towards her. Even if you only have one or two, they can launch sophisticated attacks on her. But not B, she might not have a strong team with her, because people that Biden has united in his team might go to their preferred candidates in primary elections and break up Biden's unifying force because they believe the other person is better than her. Right? So that means you have a contested nomination, which she literally might lose, and so you get the beneficial candidate they acknowledge that she is. Yes.
So you just said that Kamala stands behind the president and is credited with a lot of the policies that he proposes. Why doesn't that give her the incumbency benefits that you're talking about?
Right, but the problem is that she's not the president. She's not on her own. She's tied to the fact that Joe supported her and Joe stood by her. And then when Joe steps down and is perceived to have been weak, whereas retrospectively, she doesn't get that benefit. She's someone who was united with an ailing president, not a successful one. In a world in which she becomes the president, she takes on those benefits and graduates to being the leader of the nation. That's what gives her that power. So in their world, she doesn't necessarily win the nomination. Even if she does, you've now got a disunity, a Democratic Party that is perceived to be weak, while the Republicans will have sorted themselves. Why does she then, win when she is incumbent? First, because of all the reasons they didn't sufficiently respond to, which is if you're president, you have sufficient airtime, you control the media narrative, you can choose when to appear, what issues to talk about, you can literally sign policy that changes millions of lives overnight. That's massive. They didn't respond to that fact. They didn't respond to the fact that she can literally just have name recognition and knowledge and be perceived to be the leader of the nation. It's incredibly important. Those massive incumbency benefits let her win the primary nomination. Because people don't want to challenge her, they're afraid. And because parties' own rules allow them not to have primary nominations when they have an incumbent president in leadership. So she takes on that role. And then she wins the election, right? Because she's had those years of making changes. She is that great candidate that that they accepted she was, right? So she's able to win and dominate the political scene, and she's able to challenge others, right? Particularly no Charles pivot to, Trump's going to run, what's she going to do about that? Well, she's not Joe Biden, who QAnon people think stole the election, right? She's a new and independent candidate, but also she's, in comparison to Trump, all those things we talked about, she doesn't have baggage, she's respectable, she's liked by both white and minority voters, so she has that power to win the election, which they have accepted she's the best candidate. So, in the end, you have to ask yourself, is the media narrative so bad that it outweighs all incumbency benefits that she will have? And is she so guaranteed to win the nomination as a vice president, which does not always occur, that it is not a good thing for Biden to let her graduate to the leader of the nation and naturally assume the mantle of the next president?
Thank you very much. I now call on the third negative speaker.
debate was never about the unity of candidates. It was about the relative risk that candidate took on when they firstly went through the primaries and secondly went to the election. It was about the stability and of the unity of the base. And what we told you is that when Joe Biden steps down prematurely, you open up a gap for that very vocal minority of left-wing voters that has an incentive to destabilize the Democratic Party to get what they want, to insert that agenda back into the primaries. Even if Kamala wins the primaries, she carries that baggage, she carries that instability through to the election, and she is at risk to a higher degree on their side of the house of losing that election because she has turned off the left wing who has grown bigger, and she has also turned off the respectability Republicans who voted for Biden and were reassured that he was going to bring back respectability politics and were betrayed when it happened all again. That's how we win this debate. I'll firstly deal with how media address this issue, then flow on to how that affects the narrative. Then I'll basically relitigate that material about why the left creates instability, and that means that the risk is just not worth taking on their side of the house, and how that reduces the ability of them to win, right? Let's talk about the media. They have way too much faith in news media, right? It's not the same as New Zealand. You simply cannot analogize. There is far more hatred. There is far more partisanship. They will not be sympathetic to Joe Biden because they have a political incentive to undermine him. That is for every Republican owns news media institutions that want him to lose, right? They have a profit incentive to make the most speculative stories they possibly can, because that's the kind of stuff that people click on, and they literally just don't have any morals in the US. Like, news standards are out the door. You can do whatever the fuck you want over there, right? Keir then tries to say, well, even if this news coverage happens, you can't have 1 to 2 years of coverage. That's ridiculous. They clearly don't understand how the American politics cycle works, right? There's massive political analysis that happens at every step of the campaign. When you go to the primaries and then when you move forward to the election, everything that has happened over that cycle is relitigated in the news, right? They bring it back up each time there's another stage and a step towards the election. It comes back every time, right? But even if it only happens at the very outset when he steps down, that remains in the minds of voters. They think that he was weak. They think that he passed the torch over to Kamala simply because he couldn't hack it, not because Kamala was the natural progression of the next candidate, right? They then tell us that voters don't care about norms of staying in office, and so almost all of Karen's gotcha material, right? They care about the norm of him staying in office because they voted him in, and they expect him to have the Democratic mandate to run the country. They did not vote in Kamala Harris, so therefore they get upset when he randomly abdicates in the middle of his term and gives it to Kamala Harris. The reason why that doesn't happen on our side of the house is because he finishes his term. Kamala goes through the normal democratic processes of being elected as the candidate and winning the election, and voters feel like their democratic voice has been heard and been put into that candidate. They do not feel like that on their side of the house, right? Then we tell you that I've finished that point. So at the end of that point, what does that mean? It means that you're likely to have the media crack down on Kamala and crack down on Biden and pay them out to not know what they're doing, for Biden to be unstable, for it all to have been a massive mistake to elect Biden in the first place. What does that mean for the narrative then? They tell us that Kamala is ready to step up and is standing by Biden, but then they also want to contradictorily say that she can't claim any of the policy benefits of the policy that passes through while she's standing by her. That's clearly inconsistent, right? She does get the policy. But the problem is they can't get the benefit of the policy being attributed to her because the way that Biden unified the size of the Democratic Party and pulled in those respectability voters is why he has the unique reason in which he can pass progressive policy. When people look up there and see the imaging of a woman of color passing really, really radical policy, that is going to be far more divisive than the respectability Biden passing that policy. She is probably less likely to get that policy passed. She cannot accrue those benefits. She is more likely to accrue them when she is able to stand by Biden and basically get them by absorbing. She does not get the incumbency benefit on their side of the house because she's not voted in. People feel betrayed. They didn't vote for her to be the president. But the name recognition mechanisms they talk about are completely symmetrical on our side of the house because she's still the VP. She still does all the interviews. Everyone still knows who she is. So to the extent that there is an incumbency bias, it's symmetrical, right? Then in terms of will she win the nominations and what happens in terms of the left creating instability? We tell you that on our side of the house, the gap does not open, right? It's only that, and in the worst case, like at best it is, Keir tries to say that we won't win nominations, right? And they say that the only reason that like we won't win nominations because they have incumbency bias and we don't, which I've just proved. But even if it was true, it would just be easier on their side. I think there was no analysis to why Kamala would actually lose the nomination on our side, right? So then it comes down to the question of when you go through this messy primary process, what happens to the reputation of Kamala and how does that create a sense of democratic instability? It means it's very hard for her to win the election, even if she gets over all of the meddling of the left and actually manages to win the primary. Why does the gap open for like left-wing people to come in and meddle again? Biden hasn't died, right? He's still there. There's no real reason for him to step down. For him to step down in the middle of a term would have to be very compelling, so it literally goes against the Democratic mandate for him to be president. So it's not really enough of an explanation to say, oh, I was just feeling a bit tired. Like maybe that works for Todd Muller, but it's a very different system here, right? There's like 50 states, we all care about a lot more people, right? Where they're a little bit more mean, right? So that means that the gap opens because it seems like Biden steps down for an illegitimate reason. And there's so much Biden hate that's been quietly suppressed in this small minority that they basically just took the long and short of it to be able to get more stability. But when they see there is an opportunity to put their foot in the door, to put AOC into the primaries, to put their radical candidate into the primaries, they will do so, right? The team is over and the kind of like placating effect of the Kamala Biden team creating unity between the left and the liberals is over. She's not seen as an incumbent president, she's seen as holding the fort, she has no Democratic mandate. That means you not only get pressure from the left, you also get pressure from the respectable politics people, the people who really like Biden. They will probably run another pale stale white guy because that's the kind of people a lot of people in the US like. That means Kamala has pressure from both sides of the board because she doesn't really have the legitimacy of being the real president. People want the real president back, so they just pick Biden 2.0. I don't know, maybe Pete Buttigieg gets like shoved in there for another try, and then you still have like far more chaos going on in that situation. Why is that harmful, right? Because it removes the legitimacy that would happen if there was a simple, clean, natural progression from Biden, like not running in the midterms and saying, I'm handing over to Kamala in the midterms, in the primaries, in a way that is understood by the American people, in a way that follows democratic norms, in a way that makes them feel like it is acceptable that Kamala is basically inheriting the throne of Biden, right? That's why it's more important in this debate that we take the the timing of the negating team and not the timing of the affirmative team, right? It was a careful compromise for Biden to beat Trump, and that is undermined when people are betrayed. People don't necessarily love Kamala. A messy nomination harms the presidency race from both sides of the political spectrum. We're very proud to have stability in the US.
Great, thank you very much. Now to in terms of the reply debate, I call on the negative leader.
F opens up a massive gap in the field by having an enormous shift from the norm. They confuse the millions of people who voted for Biden and now have to deal with a different president. And it's just so confusing that they think that Fox News just forgets that Biden stepped down in the middle of his term every time 2024 comes up. For a team full of US politics nerds, it was such a weird characterization that the US media will just deal with this with delicacy and give Kamala Harris the respect she deserves in light of this. I'm going to look at only two things in this speech. I'm going to step them through very clearly and explain exactly why it is that the timing of the situation did matter. Firstly, I'm going to look through the 2024 primary field and why it is more populated on their side of the house. And secondly, look at why the media spin uniquely happens in a world where you ask questions about why the timing of him stepping down was so urgent that it had to happen mid-term. Firstly, on the 2024 primary field, why is Kamala undeterred on our side of the house? She gets the incumbency benefits and policy spreads already as vice president, right? She's always looking in Biden in the photos he posts on Twitter. She's always in the interviews where he talks about the radical COVID relief bill that Biden's able to pass. But importantly, she gets the benefit of Biden having the mana to pass that stuff really easy without her having to go out as a woman of color and try to get the Senate on side with her. Note, however, the clear assumption of Biden completing a successful term with Kamala Harris and then stepping down is that he has confidence in her to carry on his legacy. What do we outline? And I want to be really clear here that from first, we've explained exactly how people respond to a sudden step down by Biden. The first thing to say is that there are questions about why Biden had to step down now. Did he not have confidence in his team to carry out the work that was required to lead the U.S. Through the rest of his term? Secondly, though, it's the base stepping up to say that maybe another candidate might now have a chance because Kamala didn't have the trust of Biden for him to seek out his term. She needed to become incumbent president for her to have a chance to win. Two things happened as a result, right? Firstly, more people run because they think there's an opportunity from them. The people in the base who wanted Bernie to be president last time now try to put up someone like AOC because they think there's a chance, there is division in terms of how people see this response. But secondly, the voter coalition that Biden painstakingly formed is divided. They feel betrayed by the fact that he stepped down after they voted him in to be the candidate that helped unite America. I think that is radically unresponded to by the affirming team. Secondly, let's just look at media spin, because I wish US media was as unbiased and accurate and unspeculative as affirming thought. Not only would they speculate on why he dropped out, they would bring it up every time the election was mentioned, right? And they claim that this news cycle just burns out. But in our lifetime, has a president ever stepped down mid-term without any scandal being the reason? No, right? This is a huge depart from the norm. No one gives a shit about Sarah Palin outside of Alaska, but Biden is everyone's president. We think that impacts them. Why does this spin comparatively not occur on our side of the house? I think the first thing to note is that there is just a general expectation that he is a one-term president. But note that for an 80-year-old to step down after a term is actually not as strange or, as Shar says, urgent, right? Their analysis only applies in the unlikely event that Biden becomes visibly decrepit in the next 3 years. I think the timing of when he announces that he foresees himself becoming incapable matters. Because when it happens midterm, he's like, oh no, I think the next year I might become decrepit. Of course you're gonna think he's already Swiss cheese brain, right? In comparison, if he fills out his term, it is legitimate that might be a foreseeable harm, that he has pushed himself to his limit, and he thinks it's possible he won't make it 4 years rather than just 1 year. The media narrative is that he finished the term, not that he was so sick or unconfident that he dropped out halfway. We don't let the media focus on anything but the policy that Harris passed. She's far more likely to win the presidency in 2024.
I return at the end of this debate to the challenge that Keir provided the negating team in his third speech. And that was the fact that he provided analysis about the fact that media moves on. And there are basically just financial reasons why they do that. As soon as the talk about the presidency becomes oversaturated, the media simply moves on. You talk about the things that President Harris is doing. You talk about the upcoming election cycle, those sorts of things. And the response that we get to that is literally just accusations by Bella that we don't understand American media. It's not the same as New Zealand. But that's not real analysis. We provided you real analysis. So what I'm going to do in this speech is explain why it is just unrealistic to believe that we're going to have 2 years of literally Kamala Harris can't get a word in edgewise because of the chat on Fox News. And then I'm going to talk about the various benefits that we get through avoiding the nomination, winning the election, etc. Okay. Basically, the analysis from the negating team on the media overcrowding is just like it's the story of the century. No one moves on. Keir explains systematically why the media has incentive to move on. But let's step back a moment and say, let's say it is true that the American media at the moment is in a place where it stays on the same news stories for years at a time. Seems unrealistic, but let's say it's the case. They don't respond to the fact that the narrative is worse on our side. Because the narrative becomes, why did Joe Biden, with his Swiss cheese brain, quote unquote, not trust you to run the country? Why did he continue on? Because he did not believe that you were going to be able to take America forward. And the problem with that narrative, relative to the narrative proposed by the negating team, is that as soon as Joe Biden moves on, that's the end of the story. And yes, there might be a tale of speculation afterwards and ongoing op-eds that mean that it's in the discourse for at least a while, but every single time on our side, when Joe Biden makes a slip-up, every single time when Joe Biden does something wrong and he's announced that he's not going to run again, that's an ongoing harm to the credibility of Kamala Harris. On top of that, we get assertion from the negating team that there is enormous staying in the presidency. But we explain that the whole point of having a vice president is in case someone needs to step down. But we also know that just like example-wise, at the governor level, it's absolutely not true. But even if we're just like accepting norms that are entirely asserted in debating now, if that's a legitimate tactic, it can also be true that there's a huge norm that like no one has ever chosen not to run again since the 1800s. Something terrible has gone wrong. There's scandal in the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris is involved in some shady shit, and that's required Joe Biden to step down and allow Kamala Harris to get through. If we're asserting norms, we can do it too. They didn't analyse it. So, at the back end of that, we also explain that we are the side that gets Kamala Harris nominated on the basis of incumbency. We are assertion that it is symmetrical, but that's not true. It is obviously the case that the President of the United States, probably the most famous person in the world, has a greater degree of name recognition and a greater degree of display on the media and a greater degree of association with the policies of the United States of America than the Vice President does, who probably realistically is comparable at best with a high-profile senator such as those that will run in the nominations. But the other thing that we don't get responded to is that the Democratic Party might just not have any nomination at all because they simply don't have to when they have a sitting president. It's in the rules. But the last thing I want to say here harks back to my first speech, and it's a discreet harm that says if you avoid the ongoing clumsiness of white people within the Democratic Party talking clumsily about race and gender, that is something that damages the party, even at the nomination level. So as soon as we have a nomination and continue to have the random white Democrats come out, you continue to damage the Democrats. That's important because we care about winning the election. We are the only side that proves a realistic pathway for Kamala to be nominated. They run the very real risk that someone else might be nominated, so are unable to co-opt their benefits, as I point out in Appeal 1. But on top of that, we get the national incumbency benefits I discussed. But the last thing I just want to say is on the betraying the coalition thing. This only makes sense if you believe the norm that there is an expectation that Joe Biden doesn't stand down. But actually, the coalition was never about Joe Biden. It was about Biden-Harris. It was about getting rid of Trump. We think we can stick with that.
Oh, I want to touch on